Hello, News Story. We hope you have a blessed day and enjoy the sermon.
Hello, News Story. We're so glad you could be with us today.
Hello, News Story.
Hello, News Story.
Hello, News Story.
Hola, bonjour. Hello, News Story.
Hello, News Story.
Hello, News Story. What's that sound?
Hi, my name is Lucy, and I'm happy to see you all again.
Hi, Church. Welcome to New Story.
Good morning, News Story. It is so good to be with you in the flesh.
Together
At the same time.
Not sick.
Yes, treasure this moment. They don't come often.
We are healthy at the same time.
That is correct.
In the flesh.
That is correct. How have you been?
Getting better.
Yeah.
Better. Yeah. Just still got, my doctor said this little cough would linger, so, because my asthma, but everything else was gone. I told people, and I told you this, whatever I got sick with was shorter than COVID, but by far worse.
Really?
Yeah, we've just forgotten, colds, have taken people out.
There are other
for,
sicknesses.
Yeah. And it wasn't the flu, it wasn't any of that, it was just a cold, but whatever
Well, and
it was.
you wonder if, our bodies, because we've been, for the most part, secluded and wearing masks, our bodies aren't necessarily ready to face other viruses.
Yeah, my body was I don't know what that was, but I don't want no parts of that ever again. And now fall is coming up, so y'all can have it. I'm good. I'm over it.
Yes. Oh my goodness, that is the worst.
And you had a wedding last week.
I did. The last 2 weeks have been like a blur. So the last week, or the week before this previous week, so 2 weeks ago, my brother from New Mexico came into town. So we went to my parents' cabin for a few days to hang out with them because we hadn't seen them in about a year. So that was fun. And then we got back from there. We were back for one day, and then we went to Grand Rapids for Georgie and Mackenzie's wedding. Shout out to Georgie and Mackenzie. Woo, woo.
Former Newsies.
Former Newsies, yep.
Yeah.
Former Newsies, now living in Denver, Colorado, but they came back here to do their wedding. I think Mackenzie's from Grand Rapids, and her family is, and Georgie is from Naperville. So they did the wedding in Grand Rapids. It was beautiful. Yeah, it was great. It was fun. I had a good time, lots of dancing and great music. So, and it was the reception was in a public museum, in the Grand Rapids Public Museum.
Nice.
So it was a big old dinosaur hanging over our head, and just the whole atmosphere was really
That's cool.
Yeah, it was a really cool spot. And then I came home from Grand Rapids for one day and flew to Texas.
Yeah, you've been busy.
Yeah, so I'm glad to be back, and no trips for a few days.
You've been everywhere. I've been nowhere.
Everywhere and no. Yeah, Texas was fun, but so I was watching the news on Thursday morning, and they're like, good news, folks, today and tomorrow we're going to have a little cool down. The high is only 99. And I was like, what? And they're like, but then this weekend it's going to warm up again. I'm like, 99 isn't warmed up? That seems really hot to me, so.
That's the part of everything is bigger in Texas. Even the temperature.
Even the temperature, yeah.
Are bigger in Texas.
So you can have it, Texas. We love you, but you can have the 115-degree weather.
It's been nice here, though.
Oh, beautiful.
Weather has
love
been.
It.
I remember when I got here last year, so I've officially been here a year.
Woo woo.
In Chicago, I celebrated my 1 year week and a half ago. But last year when I got here, it was hot.
Yeah.
This time of year it was hot, and now it's just been in the 70s. This is nice.
Normally it is actually hot. This is abnormal.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
But it's great because it's just
nice.
very tolerable.
70s is good. I'll take the 70s.
Yeah, for sure. So on this day, I believe sometime in the 1960s, was the release of the Rocky Horror Show.
Rocky Horror Picture Show?
Picture Show.
Yeah.
I wanted to say Rocky Mountain, and I just knew that wasn't right. That's another thing. So the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So I was talking to some of our church planters in Texas, and we did this activity where I asked them to get in small groups and list 3 to 5 of the worst movies they've ever seen. So I'm asking you now, what's one or two of the worst, and y'all too, think about it, because we can have you do some shout outs, but what is 1 or 2 of the worst movies you've ever seen?
Oh gosh. You know what? So this is gonna sound weird, but like I am an 80s movie, like I love 80s movies, but they're horrible. But they're great. Like they're horrible. Like if you watch them now for like cinematic value, you'd be like, this, I can't believe they made this.
Right.
So like pretty much every 80s movie, but they're so good. You know, it's like when something's like ugly but cute at the same time.
Uh-huh.
So I would say like every 80s movie I've ever seen is like
Okay.
terrible, but also
What's
really
your favorite
great.
terrible 80s movie?
Oh, you know, The Last Dragon is my favorite.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
They're all like cult classics, but I like The Great Outdoors.
Oh, yeah. John Candy, he's great.
Caddyshack. Yeah. Gremlins. Howard the Duck.
Oh, yes.
Big Trouble in Little China. Adventures in
good. Yeah.
Babysitting.
Harry and
Terrible
the
movie.
Hendersons. Harry and the
Yes.
Hendersons, another good one.
Fun. I mean, they were great, I guess, for the 80s quality, but yeah. I'm a sucker for 80s movies.
Some of the worst movies you've ever seen? Anyone? Sharknado. That is, all of them, 1 through 9. So good. Yeah. So when I did it, I listed the Coneheads with Dan Aykroyd. That was terrible. And then there was a show called The Stupids. Did you ever see The Stupids? It's pretty bad too. So we did a fundraiser when we were youth pastors, where we did a B movie night. So it was free to come, and we had like popcorn and some dinner, and then we had 3 B movies that we were playing. And the earlier you wanted to leave, the more money it cost you to get out. So like if you were there for like 20 minutes, you're like, I just can't, I want to leave. It's $250 to get out. Jeez. But if you stay through the end of the 3rd movie, it's only like $25 to get out. So the longer you stay, the less you pay to get out. But if you want out early, which most people did,
what
pay
movies?
more. So we did those 2. So we did The Stupids and we did the Coneheads, and I can't for the life of me remember what our 3rd one was. But also any movie in sort of the Twilight, those are all. I don't like those.
Turn his mic off.
I know, I'm sorry.
Turn his mic off right now.
Taylor was a tween at the time, and she would drag me to the midnight premiere of these movies that were terrible, in my opinion. So, like, I'm staying up till 2:30 in the morning watching Twilight on a Thursday night. I got to work on Friday. Not good. Not okay.
You're better for it. I believe
I'm
it.
bitter for it.
Bitter. No. So funny story. I saw the Twilight, and then I saw the first one. I got hooked, and then I got my sorority sisters hooked. So it was like one night we were watching one of the later movies, and it was like 4 grown black women in the dark watching this movie like intently, like, oh my God, no, don't do that. So yeah, nice. It might be bad, but it's just sometimes bad movies are still those movies that like draw you in. You're like, I can't stop watching
even though it's terrible.
That's how I felt about so I've been recently watching Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, okay.
And it's been this like emotional roller coaster. I was like, I'm done with it. I stopped watching it for like a week, and then I was like, I'm curious, and so now I'm almost done with season 4.
Yeah.
Ready for season 5.
I mean, I tell you what, I've been watching it too. It's channel 202 CNN. Feel like we're living it.
It's the show is called America.
The show is called America. Okay. Announcements. What's coming up? What do we have going on here?
Hopefully not FBI
T-shirts.
rights.
Oh, we do. You can still buy T-shirts, and I did get if you ordered T-shirts, I have them, and I was going to bring them this morning, and I totally spaced it. But we do have T-shirts. I'll bring them next week, and if you ordered one, you can pay for it on the Church Center app. If you just go to the giving link, and then there's a drop-down where you can for account, and you just say T-shirts. And you can pay for it there. And if you want to order one, scan the QR code and fill out the form, and we will get one ordered. The nice thing about where we order the shirts from is you can order 1 or you can order 20, and it doesn't matter like price-wise. So we can order whenever you put your order in, we can order you a T-shirt.
Yeah, and then we got small groups starting, which I realize people are still in summer mode right now.
Yeah, it's very much summer still.
We are starting our fall rhythm technically, but I feel like people are still in summer rhythm.
Yes.
But we are starting small groups this week. So we have 2. We have me and Nikki's group. We're doing one called Motif. So if you've ever wanted to like learn more about financial literacy, it's basically a discipleship series of small groups that we've created to help with financial literacy. So we're going to be talking about lots of different topics throughout the next year. This first one is going to be like budgeting and foundations for financial literacy. So that'll start Tuesday night here at 6. So we'll have some refreshments, just kind of hang out, talk, and then we'll do that. And then, yeah, there's different topics throughout the rest of the year.
Cool. And then I'm putting one together called Who is Newstory. I'm probably going to push it a few weeks just to give more people time to sign up. But we're sort of building out what we would call sort of our discipleship pathway. And so within that is sort of a series of small groups for folks if you're new or want to know more about Newstory. So Who is Newstory is going to walk through all the sort of nuances of who Newstory is. So we're going to talk about our calendar rhythms. We're going to talk about our theology. We're going to talk about our core values. We're going to go through our theory of change and sort of why we do what we do. So kind of a deep dive into who Newstory is and sort of the best ways to sort of begin to engage and connect. And we'll have some other things coming out connected to that in the months ahead. But so if you want to sign up for Who is Newstory, you can do it there or on the Church Center app. We were going to start this week, but I think we're going to push it a couple weeks. So if you haven't signed up yet and you would like to, go for it. So
yeah, big focus on discipleship this year. Wanting to get to some of the core elements of discipleship. So that's what a lot of the groups will focus on.
Yeah,
small groups will focus on this year.
Yeah, good. What else?
Baptisms.
Well, yeah, if you want to be baptized.
Yeah, that'll be like a reoccurring thing. Like at any point, if y'all want to be baptized, let us know. Because we have this little basin.
Yes, we have a little basin that we can fully immerse you in. But we also have a small body of water just to our east that we could submerge you in as well. So
I thought about that. If y'all want to get baptized after August, I'm not doing it in Lake Michigan.
I could probably go into September, but I definitely wouldn't go into October. Yeah.
Y'all are
unless you're providing a wetsuit.
Sprinkled at that point.
That's good. Yep. All right. Next, let's see. What do we got?
I think that's might be.
That's it. Oh yeah. Well, we were going to do a Sunday Fun Day lunch, but no one has signed up, so we probably
give
will
it a little.
push that.
We'll try again, maybe in a month or two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As we said, we're still in summer mode, so we realize folks are out and about.
But if you are new or you're wanting to know more about Newstory, we do hold these regularly, so we try to have dinners. Yeah, like just to do some meet and greet and get to know folks and give an opportunity for other new folks to get to know other new folks. So if you want to come hang out and have dinner on us, get to know us a little better, get to know each other, reach out and let us know, and we'll get some more planned.
And sometimes we do it on a Friday, sometimes we do it on a Sunday. Just sort of depends on what the month looks like. So, very good. Well, do you want to open us in prayer?
Sure.
All right.
God, we thank you for this beautiful Sunday morning that we have to enjoy here in Chicago, and I pray for good weather wherever anybody is watching today, just a good Sunday in general. We thank you that we have time to come, to wrestle with you, to wrestle with each other, to wrestle with the world and this thing that we have called Scripture, God. We thank you for all that you're doing in our lives, and we just pray that you would open us up to hear your voice, to hear your word, just to really receive what you have for us today. Let us enjoy each other's company, enjoy our discussions today, and just bless our time together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, if you're able and would like to, feel free to stand. Those of you joining us from your homes or from a house party, welcome, and feel free to take this time and either sing along or pray for one another in your groups or however you want to spend this time. Grand earth has quaked before, moved by the sound of your voice, and seas that are shaken and stirred can be calmed and broken from my regard. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and through it all, it is well. Through it all, eyes are on you, and it is well with me. For be it from me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see. And this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. And through it all, my eyes are on you. And through it all, it is well. Through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well, it is well. Let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The ways and wind still know your name. Let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know your name. Let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know your name. The waves and wind still know your name. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And it is well with my soul, and it is well, it is well with my soul, it is well with my soul. And it is well with my soul. And it is well with my soul. And it is well, it is well with my soul. And it is well, it is well with my soul. And it is well, it is well with my soul. Amen. You may be seated. So, we're in this series right now on oh yeah, kids, you can go. Woo, woo, woo. So we're in this series called Ask Me Anything, and someone gets this mic. Here you go. And one of the things that we've noticed come about during this series is lots of great responses and questions regarding just the topics that we're talking about. And by nature, an Ask Me Anything series is going to stir up all sorts of things because of we're addressing, in many cases, some pretty controversial and beliefs that people are very passionate about. And so we wanted to sort of take this Sunday, and instead of answering a question from our Ask Me Anything series, just sort of have a little panel with our teaching team all together, and just sort of talk through a little bit why we're doing this series and what we're hoping will come out of it, and sort of begin to look at what's next as well. So welcome.
Welcome.
This is the first time our whole teaching team has been on a panel together. How are you doing, Dimitri?
I'm doing well.
Yeah?
Last week was so, as you all said, you both were out of town, and afterwards Hillary was like, you were like the pinnacle substitute teacher, because I came up and then I turned on a video, and I was just, I'm glad to have you all back. That's
Did you have a worksheet?
Didn't have a worksheet, but it was peak substitute teacher vibes
Nice.
last week. So I'm
love
glad
it.
to have you all here.
That is awesome. That is great. Well, so the first question that I have for the panel, of which I'm also a part, but I will also MC. So the first question is this: why did the teaching team decide to do this particular series at this particular time?
So I'll speak on this so for those that don't know me, my name's Dimitri, use he, him pronouns. And I've been at Newstory since January 2017.
You're one of the senior members now.
I know. I was like, it feels weird to be an OG newsy at this point, not as OG as Sam and Sarah, but and Jack. There's some that predate me, but not very many. And so, for those that don't know the history, right, and I won't go into it all, but Newstory has just been through a lot of transitions, even before the pandemic, and our membership, our congregation, the people that call Newstory home, we have different terms for that, has evolved even in the since 2017. And so, as a teaching team, and also as kind of like the lay person on the team, we know that there's just been a lot of questions out and about these new pastors who, prior to the pandemic weren't our pastors, and this whole teaching team dynamic. And so I was excited because I think what was bubbling up from a lot of the things that we were talking through in previous series was just a lot of questions about, how, just about sort of Christianity, spirituality. And so as a teaching team, we said, well, rather than us continuing to direct that, why don't we take a moment to just kind of see where the congregation is at? And so it really kind of came out of, I think for me, a moment of just trying to touch the people, so to speak, and making sure that we were also being receptive and open to the questions that were bubbling up, which was kind of a modality that for us was aligned with a lot of the values that Newstory had just recently established, but also was a little bit of a different series than we've been accustomed to at least since I've been at Newstory.
Thank you. I can answer that a little bit too. Back in the spring, Matt and I had started having conversations around our theological commitments, right? And so we had talked about this in the fall, how we knew that with all of these changes that had happened, we have this kind of statement of beliefs on our website right now. And as I was going through it, I was like, do we actually still believe all of these things? And so we started having these conversations around what does a theological commitment or a theological statement look like for Newstory at this particular time, after all of these changes, pastoral changes, theological shifts. And so in having those conversations, we realized how important it was to include the community. And so, we don't want to just, me and Matt can write them, I'm sure, and we can sit here as a teaching team and create all these theological commitments. But if there's no buy-in from the community, and there's no say-so and no involvement, then it's not really Newstory's theological statement, it's Dimitri, Tasha, and Matt's theological statement. And so, in the spring we started having these conversations around what does that look like? What does that process entail? And a big part of that process was wanting to include the community. And so we knew that having a sermon series like this would be imperative for that, because it would start generating that conversation. That's why we've had the Theology on Tap coincide with this. giving people an opportunity to have discussions about these questions that people have asked, right, or wanted to know. And so we knew a part of that process would start teasing out some of these things that are really important to us. We would figure those things out. But yeah, I think it was really a big part on our end was to include and start engaging the congregation in that conversation. Starting with the questions, what are people curious about? What do people really want to know? What are people passionate about? Trying to respond to them and doing it in a dialogical way that's not just us up here teaching, but us having like a conversation as a church about a lot of these different topics.
Yeah.
Can I add one
Yeah,
more
go for
thing? Because we're keeping it real. And so the other tension in Tasha's response reminded me is that, so I was on the hiring team that hired Matt. And one of the concerns coming out of that season was around Matt's sort of like visible identities, right? Like this white cishet male, and how as a church that values, sort of all of God's creation, how would we wrestle with kind of, at the time, one of our leaders having these identities. And so I think very quickly, Matt thoughtfully started to think of different ways to decenter himself, like just sort of being real. And so part of this, and Tasha saying the dialogic piece in community is another way for all of us to wrestle with our identities, our privileged identities, the identities that sometimes we lead with. And by doing it in community, both as a teaching team that shares different identities, but also in a sort of larger community that shares different identities, different questions. People are different, interested in different things. We all have very different spiritual backgrounds and upbringings. And so all of those pieces we wanted to sit with and try to entertain. And that was really important too, as we wrestle with how do we decenter not just Matt's identities, that's one of the ways it started, but just all of our identities as a teaching team, as a church community, and do that well. And so part of the Ask Me Anything series was to start to do that differently and better than we might have in the past. And so Tasha saying the dialogic piece reminded me that was also maybe not as like foregrounded, but at least on our teaching team calls was definitely part of our conversation of how we wanted to approach this series.
Yeah, and I think that the dialogical piece really fits within that Trinitarian lens of how we do theology, because we want to do theology in relationship. We don't want to make declarative statements without engaging conversation first, and having that dialogue is really that relational piece that I think is really important, which also sort of bleeds into this leadership structure that we're trying to live into that is non-hierarchical and not centralized in terms of who holds power, which means we want to incorporate all the voices. We want the feedback loops. So like Tasha said, that's why we've done the Theology on Tap sort of at the same time as this particular series, to sort of invite that conversation around what we believe. And we've been really intentional in this season to not make declarative statements. We will, but we're not making them now. And to do it in such a way that we're not answering questions, we're responding to questions, and trying to be provocative in ways that make people think possibly different than they have about certain things like the Bible or human sexuality or whatever the question that comes up is, but then also sort of leading folks to, draw some of their own conclusions and in a really thoughtful way. So last fall, when our leadership team went away and sort of did our vision planning for this year, our three main vision strategies were, one, to implement the leadership structure, which we are in the process of doing and have been doing. And I feel like in terms of living into it, we are living into it in a really helpful way. The second one was around developing a more clear, robust theology for Newstory, which is sort of what we're in process of doing. And then the third piece of our vision for 2022 was around finances and encouraging people to give, but also becoming a church that doesn't just ask for money, but is also willing to like walk around and beside people on financial stewardship, which is this new small group that Tasha's starting is really focused on helping people learn how to get out of debt and create budgets and just be fiscally responsible. And so we wanted to live into those three things faithfully. So those were our three sort of primary vision things. So I hope as I say that, you can think of like what we've been doing throughout this last year and see like all these things have been very intentional and very strategic in terms of what our vision was. So so I think that's why for me this particular time. So question 2 then, on a personal level, describe the rationale you are using when you approach each question. What is influencing the way you respond to the questions that have been asked?
I can take a stab at this one first. So to backtrack a little bit to provide a little context, this past semester, I took a course with a professor at North Park, Independent Study, and the very first book that we read was a book that I think he knew I wouldn't agree with it, and that was what we started the class off with. And he was like, we met after I read the book, and he was like, I bet you're wondering why I had you read this book. And I was like, yes. So we started talking about it, and as I'm reading the book, but as we're talking, it got me to this place where I'm like, I need to know all of the evidence, and I need to know all of the arguments, and I need to know all of the points on the topic that I'm trying to make an argument about. It's not sufficient enough for me, as a researcher, as a doctoral student, as a theologian and a scholar, to just sit in an echo chamber and only consider my point of view, right? So for me, thinking about this from like a scholarly perspective too, I approach a lot of the sermon series, and this one in particular with this idea of like, I want to look at everything that's out there. I want to see what different people are saying. I want to see what the different topics are, what the different ideas are, even the ones that I disagree with. Because that makes me a better scholar, right? It makes me a better researcher. It makes me have more solid opinions and decisions when I've actually considered everything that's out there. What is all of the evidence that's out there? So when I think about responses, that's what I'm thinking about. Like, what are all the different ways that we can approach this topic? What are all the different ways that people think about this? Sitting down with a Jewish cantor and having a conversation and allowing her the opportunity to speak from a perspective that a lot of us aren't familiar with. Although I think we should be a little more familiar with it, being in like this Judeo-Christian line. But yeah, that's been a big thing for me. It's thinking about, what do I think people have been exposed to? What do I think people haven't been exposed to? What are the real arguments here? And what are the ones, yes, that we may not agree with, or that may cause us to wrestle or may create some tension? But if we're gonna ask questions and we're gonna legitimately try to wrestle, then we have to wrestle with everything that's out there. We can't just say we're gonna ask this question, but we're really only going to discuss what we believe or what we lean into or what's comfortable or what's safe for us, because that's not really discussion. That's not really wrestling with the text. That's not really wrestling with scripture. One of the traditions that I really love in rabbinic Judaism is this idea of Midrash, where it's like literally wrestling with scripture, wrestling with the text, wrestling with the various ideas and the ways that we can look at scripture. And so for me, it's been largely rooted in this idea of like really wanting to get people to wrestle with all evidence out there, all the different points of view, so we can create more robust conversation. Because I think that actually leads us to much stronger positions in the long run. But then we can also tell people, yes, we considered this. And this is how we actually got to this perspective. But it kind of looks very one-sided when someone asks you something, you're like, well, I believe this, and they're like, have you considered this? And you're like, no. We don't want to be, because we have felt that, right? A lot of us have probably been in churches where we have felt that. I'm not going to consider your position, this is what we believe, and what you have to say doesn't matter. And so not wanting to approach it from that perspective, which creates challenges, because you bring things into the conversation that people don't always want to hear or address or think about or consider. But I'm grateful to be at a church where I feel like we can do that work, and that was a foundation, I think, for all of us in going into this sermon series.
Yeah, for me, my process starts out usually with a period of having to like deconstruct what I was taught about any given topic. I've shared before, but I was raised in a very conservative Southern Baptist church in South Florida. And a lot of what I have come to learn about the Bible, about the faith community was shaped by these views, some of which I hold onto, but others of which I've had to deconstruct and sort of relearn in a more expansive and understanding way. And so for me, I always wrestle when I'm responding to a question with like, what was I taught about this, and do I still believe that? And if I don't, then I try to understand, well, what's informing these different perspectives? Is it my education? Is it my own lived experience? Is it my spouse who sees things very different from me on a number of levels? So that's always part of my process. And then a couple of other things that I always go through as I'm thinking about the questions. One, I think very similar to Tasha, I am okay, and I don't think this always comes across, so I'm glad we're getting a chance to say this. I am okay with people having differences of opinion in the body of the Christ on a lot of things, probably more than most people. What I've been journeying through this is like, well, I also am really big on unity in the body. So how do I hold those two things in check when I want unity in the body? So I want us to agree on some things, but I'm also very comfortable with, I always pick on Tasha, but with Tasha, thinking that Paul's thorn in the side was his sexuality, right? I don't know if I agree or disagree with that, but I'm okay and comfortable with Tasha holding that view. So if I'm okay with that, then where are the lines where if somebody disagreed with me, so to speak, that I would start to feel uncomfortable? And that's been really hard. That's why I'm really looking forward to us as a church clarifying our theology, and why I'm excited about the way we're approaching the question and response as not being declarative. So for me, it feels safe, and that I can get up here and wrestle with you all and wrestle with myself about how I'm thinking about things without having to be like, this is what I think, or this is what Newstory thinks definitively, but we do need to get there on some things, and we're working towards that. But I've sort of released myself in this series from having to be declarative about all things. And so that has definitely informed me, where I've tried to be up here and say, hey, this is how I'm working through it. I want you all to be able to say how you're working through it, similar to what Tasha was sharing. And then hopefully when we get into the season of really wrestling with our theology, we'll be able to bring sort of our full authentic selves into that conversation, led by the board and our co-pastors, and really be thoughtful about it. And so I'm excited about that, but this is sort of the pre-work. And then the last thing is that as a researcher, I try to answer the question very narrowly. And I feel that tension too, because there's always like the question behind the question, and then the questions that come from the questions. And I try to answer the question, but it's a static question, right? Like they were submitted via text, so I don't know the assumptions that are being made about the questions. I don't know the background. I don't know the question asker. Not everybody signed their name. Many of the questions that we got were anonymous. And so when I read the question, I read it to try to answer the question very specifically. But one of the things I'm realizing in this journey is that there's also a lot of questions before the question, and then questions around the question that we might not be getting to. And so I'm also trying to sit with that, like, how do I respond to the question specifically, but also leave room for all the other ways that people might be thinking about the question, or the question that people really wanted answered, but is not what I'm seeing in the question. And getting into that has been challenging, but a good, I think, process for me to also sit back and reflect on.
Yeah, that's really good. We in our teaching team meetings at points, there's, it's been like, all right, Dimitri, here's the question you're going to respond to. Good luck in 20 minutes responding. Like, there's so many more things that could obviously be said, or that one question could be a 6-part series where we, sort of really unpack it. But I like this idea of wrestling. So one of the things I heard when I did the listening tour and had some one-to-ones with people when I first got here was around the process Newstory went through to become open and affirming. So if you don't know the history, Newstory was started by an evangelical organization and stepped away from that to become independent, and went through a 1-year process within the what was called the D&D at the time, the Direction and Discernment team, which was sort of our elder board, where they spent a year looking at scriptures and sort of doing this hard work around, are we going to be an open and affirming church? What's that going to look like for us? And then after a year worth of really good work, they came before the church and made a declarative statement that this is who we are. Well, you can imagine a church that was filled with people who were part of the evangelical organization that helped start the church, had a lot of questions and felt like, okay, y'all did this work for a year. We've done none of that work. And now you're just telling us this is what we believe. Like, this is hard for us to swallow. And so for us, as we began to sort of discern, how do we want to sort of unroll and clarify our theology? Well, we want to do it to where we do the work with the entire church, not just the board, not just the pastors or the teaching team, and come out and make a declarative statement, but where we intentionally create space to wrestle with these things together and do the theology in dialogue. And so I think that's where, that word wrestle is so good, because the name Israel literally means people who wrestle. And so like I was thinking of when the scribe asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he said, love God and love your neighbor. And he said, who is my neighbor? And Jesus says, let me respond to your question with a story that is very ambiguous and leaves a whole bunch of room for interpretation and is going to force you to wrestle with this question and wrestle with your own emotions and the negative emotions that his response stirred up in his audience. And all of those things were part of the dialogue that was forming their theology. And so I think for me, as I approach this, I'm hoping that our responses are provocative. And I believe they have been, because we've gotten emails. So I know that they're provocative. And so when we get the emails, we'll get together as a team and we'll read through them and we'll be like, one, we're so appreciative for this. Two, we're obviously pushing buttons. That's what we wanted to do. And it's clarifying for us in a very real way some of our non-negotiables as a church as we do this work. And so all of those things are really, really good. We want to do that. We want to be provocative, but we also want to leave some room to roam a little bit and let people find their way and wrestle as well. And so if we just got up here and said, this is what this means, and this is what it is for Newstory, without doing this work, my fear would be we'd go right back to where we were, which is, okay, y'all did all this work, but we didn't, and now you're just telling us this is what we believe, which is a very hierarchical way of doing theology, and that doesn't fit Newstory's vibe. That's not who we are. We are non-hierarchical in our leadership structure, so we are going to do theology in a very similar way. And so for me, that kind of keeping our leadership structure in mind, and then our core values of diversity, which means the whole point of diversity is being okay with our differences. And that means not just being okay with it, but actually embracing and valuing our differences, which is why we talk about intersectional theology and making space for differing points of view to coexist with one another and being okay with that space. We're gritty, we're scrappy as a church. That's one of our core values. And so embracing that grit and the process and the wrestling, I think, is part of who we are. Solidarity is one of our core values. So choosing to find empathy and really be in relationship with one another as we go through this. And so I'm wanting to see our core values. Hospitality is also one of them, embodied in this work of theology as well. So
can I add two caveats though?
Yeah.
So yes, and to everything that Matt said, and this, sort of in my own personal journey, and this definitely came out of the sermon or the response that I shared a couple of weeks ago when I was specifically responding to questions around reconciling verses around homosexuality in the Bible, and sort of how do we think about the Bible and homosexuality. And one of the things in wanting to be provocative, again, is the fine line between wanting to push people to think, but also not wanting to cause harm. And for me, that is something that we're also trying to right. wrestle with and balance, where, yeah, sometimes it's good to be provocative. It gets the people going. But at the same time, we don't want to cause harm. And some of the topics that we've covered and some of the ones that we will cover have historically been conversations or topics or Bible verses that have been used to cause harm to different segments of the body. And so that's one of the guardrails where, what's that sweet spot where we're pushing people to think, but they're able to sort of see it with the hospitality, with the solidarity, with the grit, but not in a way that's like, oh, I'm being re-traumatized by stances that the church has taken, or I'm being re-traumatized by conversations that the church, or I'm being made to question, Newstory, or question the pastors in ways that make me uncomfortable or scared or worried. And so, I think that's something else that we are wrestling with, and is one of the reasons why we're sort of taking a step back to say, hey, let's, slow down and re-narrate to make sure everybody is, coming alongside us with what we're trying to do. So some of those very fair questions and assumptions we can also address specifically. And then I'm also thinking about the kind of, it's attributed to an African proverb of, if you want to go quick, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think this is also the spirit with which we're trying to do that. But when you try to go together, that means you got to go with everybody. Right. And that's also the challenge of having a value around diversity, where people have very different opinions about a lot of different things. Once we get under the surface of the hi, hellos, there are very different theological commitments, and I think we're seeing some of those things, but we want to also have other people in the body see and wrestle with those things as well. And that work is a muscle that I don't feel like we use often in Newstory, in the church more generally, but Newstory specifically. And that makes me tense because, we're a small church. I don't want to lose anybody that we have, so it's I don't want to, piss anybody off or be like, oh, this is not a place for me. I want everybody to feel at home here, but we also aren't going to grow if we aren't doing the things that Matt shared. And so that's just my own tension and concern as a small church, where I'm we can't afford to piss people off or be provocative, but at the same time, I want to grow as disciples, and I want to live into and grow and clarify our theological commitment. So how do we do both those things well is something that I've been praying about and struggling with in my soul as we've gone through this series.
Yeah, getting comfortable with that tension, and I think that's really good. And the do no harm, if you'll notice when you look at our core values that fully inclusive is not one of them, and that is why, because there is a line at which we won't include people that are doing harm to other people. That is, so I think, these are things that we've been wrestling through, and I like I like your caveat. I had a friend after Dimitri's sermon a couple weeks ago who had said to me, well, what do you mean by fully affirming? Because some churches say fully affirming, and it just means we love you, but we want you to change. And so and I said, no, we believe, let me say it, we believe that queer identities are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and we celebrate them, and we fully empower them, and we want their voices, we want their presence, we want all of who you are. And so that is who Newstory is, and it's who we're really seeking to live into, embodying. So in my work with the Methodist Church, we talk a lot about, for those of you who don't know, I'm bivocational, all of our pastoral staff is, and I work part-time for the Methodist Church doing consulting and work with church planting. So in my work with the Methodist Church, we talk a lot about identifying what a win looks like. So in terms of this series, what does a win look like for you?
Yeah, this one. So one of the things that I've also struggled with in this series, and it's come up in different ways, is I think some of the most rich aspects of this series have come after the sermon, in the dialogue and question and answer, and not only at EPC with this group, but also just hearing some of the feedback from the different house parties. And so on one hand, I wish we were all in EPC or wherever we're going to be in the fall, so that we could get the full robustness of all the different perspectives that exist in Newstory. But I think that for me is a win. to me, I haven't experienced that many churches in general where, you have a sermon and then you actually have talk back time. You have time to hear how the message is landing with different people. And the questions that people have raised, the conversations, the disagreements that we've had here, at least at EPC, have been a win for me, sometimes almost more than the actual sermon, because it's prompted me to really start to make sense of what I'm hearing and seeing. So that's a win. I agree that, again, not the ways that we've potentially harmed. And I also want to say, like, very straightforwardly, like, I apologize, to people that were harmed by the way that I approached the sermon series a couple of weeks ago around trying to reconcile. I fully sign on to and agree with everything that Matt said declaratively about embracing queer identity folks and wanting to be a better person who can walk alongside and support. So that is a personal commitment, and it's one that I stand in agreement with as a church body. So I want to be very clear about that. But at the same time, right, like I also want to be a church, and a win for me is when we get people going, when we have conversation, when people have thoughtful reactions and ask really good questions about, like, what did you mean by that? Or do you have, a high or low view of the Bible? Or, and then we disrupt that. And just all of those things to me is one, how I learn. I learn by being challenged and having different ideas presented to me and then doing my own work to wrestle with them and follow up. But I know not everybody learns like that. And I know not everybody is at a place in their sort of spiritual walk where they can have, their views questioned or their ideas questioned without, setting aside their own views. So it's like, again, that tension of, like, I feel like it's a win because we're getting people to ask questions, but not if it's coming from a place where we're causing harm. And so it's like a tie, right? Like, it's not fully a win, and so I want to get better at that as a teaching team, and I've, shared that with you all, where I want to be squarely on the side where people trust us, people trust this process, and we can have those questions not coming from a place of, like, what do you mean this was harmful, but like, hey, I'm excited, I'm activated by this, I'm really wrestling with this too, and that for me would be more squarely a win than maybe what I've been doing or what we've been doing in the past few weeks.
Yeah, that's good.
I think for me, just the fact, sometimes as tough as emails can be, when you get emails and you get lots of feedback, and whether it's positive or critical, I think just the conversations, the idea that people are wrestling too, and that they have thoughts and ideas, and they want to say something about the sermon series, or they want to contribute in some way. Like, to me, that's a win. Some people would look at that as like a defeat, right? Oh, somebody didn't like my sermon, I feel defeated. Or they had a critique of it, I feel defeated. And it's like, not defeats, it's these conversations are actually doing what we wanted them to do. You don't always realize that that is difficult.
Careful what you ask for.
Right. Which can be difficult, right? Which means people aren't always going to agree, and how do we deal and wrestle with that? So for me, that has been a win, just knowing that people are that passionate too. If I'm not passionate about something, I'm not going to send an email about it. And let me tell you, we've had some long emails. So people are passionate about some of these topics, right? I'm not going to send a long email about that if I'm not passionate
like, y'all
about
be
it.
writing essays. I'm
I
not
know,
doing that.
I'm a
PhD
doctoral
student.
student. I'm like, I'll see some emails and I'll be like, I'm gonna let y'all respond because y'all like to write, and I'm gonna sit down and have conversations because that's what I do better, and I'm tired of writing. But no, like, it is, because you read all the feedback and you read all of the points, and then we have our conversations as a teaching team. And we got to the point where we were like, oh, this is exactly what we wanted to do. It's just when you see the reality of it, it's not always fun and it's not always sexy. And so for me, I think just the conversations, positive and negative feedback, have been wins. I think another one for us is, like, one of the other things that we wanted coming into this sermon series and in trying to do our theological commitments is we're starting to see what our non-negotiables are. Very quickly learning, like, no, these are things that we're gonna have to have theological statements on. Like, this is a non-negotiable for us, right? LGBTQ inclusion is going to be a non-negotiable, right? So we know that. And so this is what we wanted to, but we wanted to do that in process with each other. So people will say, like, well, why did you guys come to this conclusion? Well, we went through this whole process. And lots of people had lots of thoughts. We had lots of conversation about it, and we are fully on board with this being a theological commitment as a church, and we did the work to get there.
Yeah, there's a depth to
Yeah, so I think like starting to see that some of those things that are non-negotiables for us, I think that's a win.
Yeah, I love that, and 100% agree. I feel like for me too, this within sort of the deconstruction process that people go through, you start with sort of simplicity in what you believe, and then you get introduced to complexity, which is where deconstruction really starts to happen. And you have to walk through this complexity where you feel disrupted and undone, and you're questioning everything. And then eventually, as you work the process, you come out on the other end with a simplicity on the other side of complexity. So a simplicity that takes into account complexity and is able to sort of live with the complexity and not feel intimidated by it. And so, my hope is that we're sort of doing that work together. That Newstory this year is going through somewhat of a deconstruction process as a faith community where we're walking through complexity, and there's a lot of disruption, and there's a lot of question, there's a lot of undoing, and there can be a lot of anxiety in that. But my hope is that we can get as a community to simplicity on the other side of complexity, where we're able to sort of coexist with this difference. We're able to really embrace an intersectional theology where we can hold two things that seem to be in tension at the same time and not feel like we need to conquer or give one up. And so, so that's sort of what a win looks like for me.
And I'll add just another more personal win is, so unlike these two, I've never been into anybody's seminary. I've never been formally, classically trained. And so a lot of my learning has been, and one of the reasons why I felt led to say yes to the teaching team and have stayed committed to it is because I think so I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I've always, in previous church experiences, I've had a disconnect with the pastors where it's of course, y'all have to say some of these things. You're paid to say these things, to take these stances. But what is it like for the regular folk? And so coming alongside these two and trying to also kind of be a bridge to the congregation that is more, I think, that is different, not more, that is a different approach to teaching. But in that, I was on a win streak where I was up here, I've been preaching now for a year and a half, and I've only had good feedback. I've never, up until a couple of weeks ago.
That's not our case, by the way.
I had never, it was either radio silence, or it was text messages or people following up hey, thanks for the word. So it was, for me, it was a win to get some of the questions and the critical feedback, because it disrupted my sort of teaching and sort of thinking about what I'm doing up here, and has made me more thoughtful to think about all of the things that I had come to take for granted. For example, to be very clear, I have seen the faces around here at EPC, so when I'm preparing a sermon, I'm often thinking about you all. Not to forget that there's this little iPhone here that is, live streaming this out to the globe, and sometimes forgetting that people might be viewing Newstory, seeing me for the first time in months, in years, or ever. And so how am I making my sermons accessible and approachable to people who I don't see on a regular basis is a big learning curve for me. It has changed how I think about this series and how I think about sermons moving forward. So all that to say, a win for me has just been my own personal growth. I still don't know what God is doing with me on this teaching team, and why I feel called and led to be alongside you all. But in the last few weeks, especially coming off of the sermon I gave a couple of weeks ago, I feel refreshed that I'm living into part of my calling. And that wouldn't have come without some of the questions and critique and feedback from the community and then to be able to process it with you two, and to feel both uncomfortable and comfortable that this is what the wrestling process is supposed to look like. So feels like a win. Didn't feel like a win a couple of weeks ago, but with time I've been able to sort of think through that and want to get better at doing some of those things.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, final question. This is more of a quick one, but what's next? What do you envision this series being a stepping stone to?
Yeah, I think having more conversation. I think this is a good launch pad for like having other conversations around related topics too. It's like one of the ones, and this was a hard part for us as a teaching team, because when we're going through these topics, it's kind of like, well, what do we say? What do we talk about now? What do we say for later when we know we're going to have an upcoming sermon series on it? So one of the upcoming sermon series that we've been talking about, and that's really I'm passionate about, is having one on like sexual and relational ethics. So it was hard because it was like, do we put that conversation in that, or do we touch on it, or do we prime that conversation and then go back to it? But of course, we realize there's a gap because what we do on the teaching team doesn't always come out and doesn't always translate. So we know what we're doing. Mm-hmm. The church doesn't always know what we're doing. So we are like, we have all this methodology, but we haven't always conveyed that. And so I'm just excited to think about what other sermon series are going to come up that will relate to what we're talking about, where we'll continue this work, but we'll start clarifying some of those positions and really start looking at what do we really believe and start taking some stances. So I think this is really like prime the pump for us to start doing that work and really set a foundation for us to have some solid theological statements that we've worked through multiple sermon series, through Theology on Tap, through conversations, through our house party discussions. Just looking forward to like the product that comes out of these conversations. These starter conversations is what I would say.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, for me, a couple of things. One, and I've mentioned it a couple times already, but in this season from this sermon series, I am really feeling a yearning in my spirit around what does unity in the body look like? What does that mean? And so as we make these theological commitments, which I'm excited about, how do we also think through what unity in the body looks like? And how do we maintain those two when at times, depending on what we ultimately declare or the commitments that we ultimately make, how those might be unappealing or uncomfortable to the point of disconnecting from this body. How do we wrestle with that, and what things are we okay with that? And what things might that cause us to even reconsider something that we were already thinking was going to be a non-negotiable. And so I'm nervous about that because I don't think churches or organizations do that well. And again, as a smaller church that's trying to rebuild and grow on this side or this phase of the pandemic, knowing where we're at financially, like I feel a lot of tension around that. So in terms of where we go next, it's thinking through like when we start to make commitments, and if that alienates people or if that makes people uncomfortable, what are we okay with? Clearly that's a commitment, so we'll be okay with it, but then how do we deal with the fallout of that, right? And I think one of the underbelly messy things about some of the Newstory transitions is that in the midst of some of those commitments, the fallout of people falling away for a variety of reasons then has implications for the finances of the church, has implications for the volunteer base of the church and who we go to do things. And if people, so it's like if we have all these commitments, but then we have nobody in the pews except for a few people who are already doing everything and are burnt out, is that a win? And maybe it is. I want to be very clear. Maybe it is, but I just feel led, by the Spirit to continue to sound that question of like, yes, commitments, but also unity in the body, and how do we move back and forth between those two things. And then I think the second one is, and this is the educator in me, so for those that don't know, like my mom was a guidance counselor, my sister works for a school district, my grandparents were educators in Jamaica. I want us to be better scholars, right? Not to say that everybody has to, do research or love to read books, but I want us to be able to say the word hermeneutics and people know what that means. I want us to be able to talk about a Trinitarian and intersectional theology and people, because I think that will make us all better Christians if we can get into some of, and we're not just taking what the pastors say, but you can go home and you can say like, oh, Dimitri talked about hermeneutics, but I'm going to be able to do a little bit of research and challenge Dimitri, and that's one of the things I loved in the response. Like people came with like really thoughtful things where I'm like, yeah, like. And I was, fortunately able to say, like, I considered those things and it just didn't make it. But I love that, right? And so I want to be sort of engaged scholarly church, and I think we're doing that work. But I hope people are as excited about it because it's easy for the professor, right, to like want to get engaged in research. So I hope others are excited and activated by doing that work and process with us.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I just echo everything you all said. I feel like I want... My hope is that this series is just another step of Newstory, really having a clear sense of who we are and what we believe and what we're about, and that it would be something that gets us excited and motivated as we sort of move into this uncharted territory of living in the world that we're living in, and with all the unknowns and all of the question marks and about the future. And so to be... there's a really unique opportunity for the church to really be the church in our world that I want to see Newstory embrace and be a part of. And I think this work of really clarifying who we are, what we value, our leadership structure, our theology, like all of this internal work is preparing us to be that. And so I'm excited about that. Yeah. Good. Any closing remarks?
No, the last thing I'll say is that I know we've sort of talked, pretty casually about the feedback and things, but I just want to be as clear as possible. Like, it's good and we welcome it.
Yes.
But we also talk about it and we process it and we think deeply about it. So I don't want our sort of reactions and comments to come across as like, we don't want it. We actually do, but we take it very seriously. And we had an emergency meeting, after the sermon last week, just to make sure we were processing thoughtfully, all of the feedback that we were getting, and we'll continue to do that, if and when it's necessary on top of our regular meetings. So, please don't, take anything that we share today as a way of not inviting that feedback. Like, it's really important to us because of the dialogic, because of the way we want to be community oriented. So this is just, another invitation, another reminder to always feel comfortable, please, to the extent that it's possible, to feel comfortable sharing insights and feedback. One of the good things about having 3 very different teaching team members is that if you don't maybe feel comfortable sharing initially with Matt or Tasha, you can share with me, and and we can hold things in confidence and say, like, I just got this message, I'm not gonna say who from, but this is the spirit of what I want to raise up. And other times people are comfortable, naming, what they were sharing. So we were thoughtful about how we share the feedback, when we name things and when we don't. I just want to provide, peel back what that looks like when we get feedback. There's lots of different ways we share it with each other to protect people's confidentiality and comfort. But we do want to always lift out the spirit of what people are trying to get us to think about as a teaching team, and reflect on that and grow from that. So it's a whole process in and of itself that I think we all take very seriously and look forward to continuing to evolve as well as we move into later stages of this series and future series as well. So just know that's what that process looks like. It's not like us just like so-and-so said whatever. It's like, no, like we treat it with the spirit of integrity. That's really important to us.
Yeah, I just would say, overall, I'm grateful to be at a church that allows that space to have conversation. And I've been in spaces where that's not allowed. You express your opinion and they're like, okay, that's great for you, but that's not what we believe. So as hard as the work is, this idea that community is messy, as hard as it is, as difficult as it could be, like what you were saying, Dimitri, we value everybody's thoughts. We value everybody's opinions, beliefs, because a lot of people have real personal stake in these things. This stuff means a lot for a lot of folks. And so we never want to negate that or devalue that. I think sometimes we can laugh about certain things afterwards, but that doesn't devalue any of it. It's just okay, we learned from that. And it can be an interesting story later, but we definitely value the feedback, and we value opinions, and we value differences and diversity. You know, that's who we are. And so it's just grateful. I'm grateful to be at a church that allows us that space and where people feel comfortable actually doing that. I know that there are probably spaces where people are like, I have lots of thoughts, but I'm never going to express them. So just the fact that we've created enough safety for people to say, hey, I have a thought about this, I want to tell you about this, I think that's a really unique part of Newstory, and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, and there is a I guess for lack of a better word, like the cultural zeitgeist of America right now is non-hierarchical, right? There's skepticism about institutions. And so I think some of the things that we're doing theologically, some of the things that we're doing with our leadership structure reflect that, and in really important ways in contextualizing our church for the world that we live in and the people God's calling us to reach. But with that, and I think this is my challenge to y'all, the flourishing of Newstory will not be dependent on a charismatic leader because of the way we're decentralizing things. So if Newstory is going to flourish, it's going to be because we all stepped up. And you know, some of the stuff we've been talking about, and yes, I know it's summer and we're all going in different directions, but at some point, like as a church, we're going to have to take responsibility together for doing this work, for doing the volunteer work, for stepping up and owning it and showing up. And so I think that's the challenge I would put back to us as a church, that I think is also something that needs to be said as we sort of decentralize this thing. It's no longer dependent on one or two leaders to make this thing happen. It is dependent on us all. And the more sort of we spread the power and the more we decentralize, the more true that's going to become. And so that is a call for us all to step up and really play our part in saying, like, what do we want Newstory to be, and what's my role in helping make that happen? So, yeah, I appreciate you both. I appreciate you all out there. I love being a part of this church. And this is exactly the kind of church that I dreamed of being a part of. And so it is a joy to serve alongside y'all. So, yeah, good. Let's close with just one song. I know we went a little bit long here. I apologize. But we'll close with one song. We're going to do a little hymn. Woo! And then we will be on our way. Talk amongst yourselves. Dimitri, I thought you were leading the song.
Karaoke style.
All right. Stand with me if you are able and willing. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, and I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first King of heaven, my treasure thou art. Be my compassion, my love for the poor. Break my distraction so I can't ignore the least of your children, the ones you adore. By them, oh Jesus, I worship you, Lord. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Jesus, I thank you for this community. I thank you for your love and your grace for people. Empower us, God, and lead us to create a space for folks to feel loved. God, a space where people feel empathy and can sit and stand with one another no matter what we're going through. And God, that we'd be a church that brings hope and light to our city and to a country that's filled with uncertainty and fear and anxiety. God, help us to be a welcoming church. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Thank you all for sticking around, and we'll see you next week.